Right. Well, thank you, everybody. And thanks very much, Allison and Josh, for the invitation to be here. I'm here on a little bit of short notice, and my one condition on agreeing to do that was that it be made clear that I am Jane Goodall's replacement. And you better believe that's going on my resume somewhere. I've heard Ms. Goodall speak in person a couple of times. For those of you in the room, I'm sure a number of you have. She just has a presence that I will not be able to match. But I hope to make up for that with some terribly depressing information. So, as you heard, I'm a physicist. I'm trained in sciences, but for the last quantum optics, if anyone's curious. But for the last 15 years, what I've really been doing is something kind of opposite to my training, which is synthesizing a very broad spectrum of science, not just physics, but the science of climate change and the science of global change, which of course includes all of what we call the hard sciences, physics and chemistry and biology. But of course, this whole broad spectrum of what I call the harder sciences, the social sciences as well. So I spend a lot of my time trying to understand food systems and economics systems, energy systems, things that I was not really trained in, although for the last 15 years I've been studying, but through a lens of synthesizing this for the story that it's telling. So at this conference, as I sat this morning and listened, I realized that what I'm about to say is probably less useful to you than when I present similar information to many other groups, because working in public lands, you are already working at the intersection of so many different things, both scientific and cultural. And just what I heard this morning was spectacular and wonderful and thought-provoking. But what I can offer, I think, is sort of my own telling of this narrative, of this fully entangled suite of ecological and social crises that we now inhabit, this landscape that we inhabit. And what I want to do is briefly review at least how I understand this suite. This isn't really only my telling. Many people who work in this field, I think, are starting to coalesce around this framework and then introduce to you a formal framework, which some of you may have heard of, many of you probably not. It's relatively new, only about a decade or so old, but I find particularly useful for those of us working on pieces of the problem, to be able to understand where our pieces fit in the larger picture, and then, of course, the importance that is as we choose things to work on and pathways for response. As I was just talking to Josh just before we started, he said, of course, well, we put out all the problems, but of course, what we all want to know is what do we do? What do we do? And of course, this is a story that we're telling. It's a scientific story, it's a cultural story. Most importantly, of course, it's an unfinished story. And that's what we're here to do, is to figure out what we do. But as we do that, and certainly as you do that within your particular realms in this topic, the many-faceted topic of public lands and public lands policy, as we try to figure out where to put our time and energies, what to support, what directions to take, what next steps to take, it's important that we understand as completely as possible the full landscape that we inhabit, so that we don't pursue vigorously paths that exacerbate other critical problems, but rather paths that synergistically help us with those problems. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. This is just from last week. Many in the room probably familiar with Vaclav Smil, a now emeritus professor who is kind of a famous futurist. He's got a new book, and this was an excerpt in Time magazine. The New York Times did also an article on this just last week with the title, "The Modern World Can't Exist Without These Four Ingredients. They All Require Fossil Fuels." The four ingredients are cement, steel, plastics, and ammonia. Most of you can probably figure out where those fit in the world. Ammonia, of course, with synthetic fertilizer. I don't want to spend any time on those. He gets a few things wrong, but he gets an overall picture about right in terms of painting a scale of the challenge that we face. But I don't want to focus on any of that. I want to focus on that word, modern world. Can't exist without these four ingredients. So I want to talk about the modern world for just a second. This interconnected suite of ecological and social crises that we inhabit. And we'll start with climate. I'm quite certain everyone in this room is very familiar with the story of climate change. I'm not going to spend any time on the details, but here's what it looks like from the end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th to today. That's the warming part of climate change. This is temperature change. It looks pretty dramatic, and it is. You can see that the warming is fully global as the different places go from the cooler blues to the warmer reds. The deeper the red, the more the warming. So the North Pole did not get warmer than the equator in this picture, but it is warming faster. If you average them all up, though, we've warmed 1.2 degrees Celsius, mostly over the last century or so, most of that in the last 40 years. Most of that in the last 40 years. And for those of you metrically challenged, that's about a 2-degree Fahrenheit global average temperature rise. You can always convert a temperature change from Celsius to Fahrenheit, roughly double it. Well, that's what it looks like. That's the warming part of it. It's happening principally because of this. This is atmospheric carbon dioxide measured in parts per million. How many carbon dioxide molecules for every million other molecules? Again, I won't be spending much time on this piece of the story. But I want you to notice the spike there starting at about, it starts to go up. This is the last 1,000 years you're looking at. Over on the right-hand side of the graph, it starts to go up about the end of the 18th century and really starts to spike in the middle of the 20th century. Since we really understood climate change was a big problem needing immediate action, say start at 1990, we have more than doubled the amount of carbon dioxide that we've dumped in the atmosphere in all of history since that time. We're at 420 parts per million today, up roughly 50% from the baseline of 280 parts per million, where we've been for the last 12,000 years as we came out of the last ice age. And it is this greenhouse gas, the most important of greenhouse gases, by no means the only one, and that is driving climate change. It comes from burning fossil fuels, and of course for this group, another large piece of that is land use changes, which involve carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases as well. But the situation leads the mainstream scientific community to make statements like this. What kind of risk do we face from the warming and the concomitant climate change that it has put underway? This is Kevin Anderson, one of the world's premier carbon modelers in the UK. What he means by a 4C future is 4 degrees Celsius of global average warming above pre-industrial temperatures, of which we've warmed 1.2 degrees already. Incompatible with an organized global community. You see this language not only in the public statements of scores and scores of scientists who work on this, but also in the scientific literature as well, which is something somewhat unprecedented, certainly unusual in the world of cold, clear-eyed science to make these kinds of statements. But he goes on, likely to go beyond adaptation. We often use this word catastrophic, and in the scientific world, that's what we mean by catastrophic, likely to go beyond adaptation, be unadaptable, devastating to a majority of ecosystems, and a high probability of not being stable. What I'm doing here is just kind of giving us a sense of the scale of risk. I want to set the stage very briefly, and I want to focus on that last bit as if the previous statements weren't sobering enough. A high probability of not being stable. What does he mean by that? Our Earth system, and as a piece of that, the climate system, is a complex system, and most complex physical systems have this kind of what we call sometimes nonlinear behavior. I like the word twitchy. You push them a little, they respond a little. You push them a little more, they respond a little more. You push them just a little too much, and they respond very dramatically and take you to a different place. And a nice metaphor for this is the Titanic. Of course, we all know the story. Most of us have probably seen the movie. They hit the iceberg, and it's not so bad, right? A few champagne glasses tip over in first class, and there's some ice on the deck that Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet kick around. But it doesn't seem so bad. Seems like a near miss. But the guy who built the boat is on the bridge, and he's looking at the lights. Where's the water coming in? And he says, we've got to get everybody off the boat. And the crew says, well, what are you talking about? That wasn't so bad. And he says, no. This ship can stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded, not 5. And he can see they're flooding 5 compartments. So he knows that is a threshold, that is a tipping point. What was a stable state of the ship on the surface of the Atlantic is going to transition to another stable state of the ship on the bottom of the Atlantic. And he knows that's going to happen because we've crossed that threshold. And it doesn't happen immediately, right? It takes a few hours to play out. You can watch the movie. But that's where it was going. And that's this notion that Kevin Anderson is getting at. There are thresholds, there are tipping points in the climate system. We're uncertain as to what all of them are and exactly what those thresholds are, but we're pretty sure that the climate system has them. In fact, it is the story of the last several million years of glacial, interglacial cycles of the Earth, going from one stable state a glacial state to another stable state, an interglacial, with not much stop in between. And so we want to avoid those thresholds. Because even though we humans are enormously adaptable to different climates, we all know that, right? That 2 degree Fahrenheit change in global average temperature doesn't seem like a lot. It certainly changes more than that when I just walk out that door into the hallway. And we can exist, we humans, in all kinds of climatic conditions. Human civilization, on the other hand, is another story. Very finely tuned to this Holocene climate, very stable climate of the last 10 or 12,000 years or so. You might say we're very finely, naturally selected for the environment in which our civilization has arisen. And so as we wander out of that stable state and risk transitioning to a very new stable state, a very much different stable state, not 2 or 3 or even 4 degrees Celsius warmer than we are, but let's call it 6 or 8 degrees Celsius warmer than we are. And that might take a couple of centuries to play out, but once we cross the thresholds, the risks become much, much larger. The chances of us being able to reverse that, once you cross those thresholds on any kind of a human timescale, go up dramatically. So the chances that we can reverse that drop dramatically. So we need to avoid that. And of course, this is the climate, one of our ecological crises that we inhabit. Emergencies. And again, using that term very precisely, an emergency is a situation that requires an immediate response to prevent catastrophic outcomes, which is precisely where we are. Let me make that a little bit clearer. The base level physics equation here is very simple. More carbon in the atmosphere is more risk. And so if you identify a danger line, you don't want to go above. And there are many identifying a single number as a danger line is problematic. There are people already on the planet who have already experienced catastrophic impacts from the changes we have already had. To date, though, those changes, even those catastrophic changes, have been sort of localized both in time and space. As we move towards higher and higher change, we transition to becoming much more globalized catastrophic impacts where it's happening sort of everywhere all the time. Of course, dramatically impacting our ability to respond. So we identify, but with the qualification that identifying a single number is problematic. That's kind of what we've done, at least to give ourselves a simple, understandable goal. That simple number is 1.5 degrees Celsius, of which we've warmed 1.2. And given that line, you can calculate a carbon budget. How much more carbon can you stick in the atmosphere? And hope to stay below that change. There's our budget. This is as of last year, closer to 300 gigatons of carbon dioxide now, 300 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And even that number is not particularly interesting. You don't have to remember it. Here's how fast we're going to burn through that budget. Certainly before the end of this decade. And this is a very straightforward calculation. And there is uncertainty in that, of course. Hopefully the budget is bigger. It could well be smaller. And when the risks are this big, of course, uncertainty is not our friend. Uncertainty is a call for more caution, not less, when you're pretty close to the edge of the cliff and you're not quite sure where the edge of the cliff is. Relative to the carbon reserves that we are already extracting, the ones we've already found and already extracting, there's our budget. You know, this isn't progressive or liberal or conservative or Republican or Democrat. This is just physics. The physics tells us that any meaningful level of risk management at this point means we can only burn about 5% of the carbon reserves that we've already identified and are currently extracting, and will currently burn through in the next 6 to 8 years. So that's climate. And it's enough to deal with. It's almost an insurmountable task at this point to meaningfully mitigate this. It certainly feels that way. But what I want to do now is place that in a larger context as one piece of the puzzle that we're facing. So I sometimes say that any sensible speaker would just sort of stop here and maybe take questions, but we're going to keep going. To a separate topic, which is life on the planet, the biosphere. What's happening with the biosphere? Well, Ecologists tell us we've wiped out approximately 70% of the world's living creatures. That's the populations. 70% of the world's living creatures in the last 40 years. They also tell us that we've elevated the extinction rate somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times above the background extinction rate. We could be losing species something on the order of 40 to 50 a day. By mid-century, 1 million species are facing extinction. This is largely not due to climate change, but habitat destruction. Seabirds down 70% since the middle of last century. Elephants, 70%. Large cats, 90%. Large fish, 90%. Sharks, 95%. The list goes on and on and on. Ecologists tell us that over a 3-year period, over the last 5 years, we lost about 20% of the world's coral reefs due to ocean heating and bleaching. They tell us if we hit 2 degrees Celsius of warming, again, we've hit 1.2, we're going to lose all of the world's coral reefs. A fundamental piece of the ocean biosphere, housing something like 25% of the ocean species, primary source of protein for 1 to 2 billion people. Across Europe, 3/4 of the flying insects have disappeared in the last 3 decades. Across the Caribbean, that number is 90 to 95%, maybe even higher, over the last 40 years. Just doing a quick calculation for you, 1 million species over the next several decades. We could be losing species at 100 species per day, out of an estimated 10 million to 30 million species that exist on the planet. This is a biodiversity crisis. The living web that we're a part of is undergoing a collapse. And that is almost entirely not driven by climate change. The ecologists tell us about 15% of what I just showed you is from climate change. The rest of it is from habitat destruction, hyper-extraction, hyper-pollution. So fix climate change tomorrow, most of what I just showed you in that biodiversity crisis does not change. Now, as climate change progresses, of course, that has a larger and larger impact. But at the moment, everything I just showed you, which is catastrophic enough, is essentially separate from climate change, at least as a crisis that we face. Okay, of course it's not separate because the same human systems that are driving climate change are driving that biodiversity crash. And now let's take a look at how those same civilizational systems are serving the people on the planet. Just a couple of, kind of a quick dashboard here. 3 billion people out of nearly 8 billion on the planet now exist in some form of critical human deprivation. 70 million have been forcibly displaced from their homes, both from climate change and political instabilities. Of course, a lot of that being interconnected. Let's think of Syria, in which a really intense 5-year drought drove large numbers of that population into urban centers in a society that was already stressed. They collapsed into civil war, and we know how catastrophic that has been. 40 million people today exist in some form of modern slavery. That's 3 times as many people under a form of bondage today as were imported into the Americas over 3 centuries of slavery. That's today. So the human well-being outcomes are not particularly good, and inequity, of course, is also extreme. 24 people on the planet control the same wealth as the poorest 4 billion. 3 Americans today control as much wealth as the poorest 200 million Americans. 3 Americans control as much wealth as the poorest 200 million Americans. We're not talking about some people get a little more, some people get a little less. This kind of inequity is utterly extreme, and it is another emergent crisis from the same systems that are driving our biodiversity collapse and climate disruption. Just to underline that inequity, about 10% of people on the planet are currently responsible for 50% of our material and energy consumption. From a climate lens, that's 50% or so of our emissions. If that top 10% of the world's emitters, extreme emitters, just cut their emissions to the average European, that would eliminate 1/3 of our carbon emissions right there. So the room for us to respond is also hugely inequitable. There's a lot of slush at the top that can go away. and make huge strides. A third of our emissions just from those top 10% of the world's emitters. 20% of the world's population emits 80% of our emissions, 80% of our material and energy consumption. That includes all of us in this room, to be sure. I suspect a number of us in this room also fall in that top 10%. The top 1% of emitters in the United States, about 3.5 million people, emit as much as 2,500 times as much as the poorest 1% in the world, the lowest emitters. 188 billion, 27 times the world population of these people to equal the emissions of these people. Inequity is extreme, and with respect to carbon and material and environmental impact, overwhelmingly, the ability to affect that lies in the developed nations, not the developing world. Okay, so climate, life, people, all emergent from the systems that drive our human civilizational metabolism, this extraction and production and excretion of waste. What I want you to do is not try to read the graphs too hard. All apologies for this visual assault. Just look at the shapes of the graphs. The growth, and look at where it really explodes about the middle of the 20th century. These are trends in the Earth system. This is changes to atmospheric chemistry and greenhouse gases, changes to stratospheric ozone, temperature, changes to ocean chemistry, extraction, hyper-extraction from the biosphere, nitrogen to coastal ozone, of course, coming from agriculture. Just look at the shapes of the graphs in the middle of the 20th century. Land system, also extreme impacts, skyrocketing. And what is driving that, of course, the Earth system trends are these socioeconomic trends. Think of these as our people systems. Again, simply look at where the graph starts to spike with this growth. Think of foreign direct investment there as a proxy for globalization, no longer local scale, but a global scale. Also, real GDP as a proxy for material and energy consumption. And again, look at the spikes. So we're measuring things that clearly have an impact on the natural world. And again, the middle of the 20th century is kind of a really key location. Right, so the Earth system trends are the symptoms, the socioeconomic trends. This human civilizational metabolism is the driver of that. There's an organization, a large organization called the Global Footprint Network. They synthesize many thousands, tens of thousands of data sets across the world to understand how much material and energy we're consuming. They've been doing these calculations for many decades. We are currently over-consuming our resource base, the current human civilizational metabolism. To sustain it at its current level of extraction and excretion requires 1.7 planets worth of resources. We're in overshoot at 170%. So we are already highly unsustainable. So this is the good news. Those systems that are driving intense climate disruption, potentially soon to be catastrophic climate disruption, and biodiversity crash, those systems, they're going away. And they're going away pretty soon. Here's how soon. What is driving this overconsumption is growth. And our plan on purpose, this is what the economic profession tells us that we have to do. This is what the G7, the G20, the Davos set meet to figure out every year is how can we continue to grow 3.5% every single year. Our current economic system requires growth in order to thrive. It requires growth in order to thrive. So 3.5%. At 3.5% growth, that's a doubling time of about 23 years. So grow anything at 3.5% a year, it'll double in 23 years. So our plan on purpose, and this, by the way, is a shared plan. This is the one thing that unites all political stripes, right? From Milton Friedman to Paul Krugman, from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, for that matter, we got to grow. We got to grow. Economic growth. Economic activity has to grow, tightly tied to material and energy consumption, 3.5%, meaning that our plan on purpose is to be overconsuming by more than 3 planets worth of resources in the next 2 decades and 4 planets worth of resources in the next 6 decades. And the science of complex systems, and certainly lots of indicators, tell us that we're never going to get anywhere close to this level of overshoot before the wheels start coming off the cart. So it's not a question of transform or not transform, keeping the same economic system that we have, this growth-based neoclassical economic system. It is going away, and it's going away in the next several decades. Hard landing or soft, of course, is what we need to figure out. If we just crash out of it, it's going to be pretty awful. If we can navigate our way out of it, and there are roadmaps to do so, to move to steady state economic system, economic frameworks that do not need to grow in order to thrive, then of course the pain is much less, although certainly large transitions are certainly necessary. Right. Just to further emphasize this point of inequity, if everybody on the planet consumed like those of us in this room consume, we wouldn't be over-consuming our resource base at 170%. We would be over-consuming it at over 500% already. That's if we let everybody on the planet consume at the rate that we consume in this room. Okay, so driving this, of course, is growth. I want to just give us this has kind of been my mission for the last year. These are the narratives I'm working on right now, because even though climate change seems to be sinking in, it's taken a long time, but polling shows us that majorities of Americans, even here in Utah, believe climate change is a thing and it needs to be addressed. But driving it is growth, along with these other huge challenges. We must stop growing. We must transition away. The economic profession, and I've had many of these discussions with them, some of my own colleagues at Utah State University will tell us, Rob, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And they wash it all under the rug with one word, and that word is innovation. The Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. Now, there is certainly some validity to the point, which of course is what makes it such a difficult misconception to debunk, because there's a kernel of truth to it, and that is when you're in a local system, you can certainly decouple your economy from a particular resource, stones, let's say. We decoupled from whale oil. We can certainly decouple from carbon completely, but you cannot decouple from all material and energy use. And let's assume that technology has given us, the Star Trek thing. You walk up to it and you tell it you want a sandwich and it just makes it, and there it is. It still needs energy. The master resource is energy. The master resource is energy. Economic growth requires growth in energy consumption, period. You can get more efficient, but only to a point. Now, I want to just really hammer this point home, because as we move forward in the work that we're all doing, often what we face among the most well-meaning audiences, the most well-meaning policymakers and activists, is trying to link this. We should take this step and we can grow. Deploy green energy, and we can build economic growth off of that, right? I mean, this is the plan of many progressives. I colored in a few black pixels at the center of the O right there. If I kept coloring in that same number every second, arithmetic growth, it would take 10.5 hours to fill up that screen. But if I go to exponential growth, which is what we're doing, which is when you say a certain percentage of growth every certain amount of time, the story is different. So I'm going to implement 100% growth every 1 second. Instead of 10.5 hours, I put the dot up on the left there. Here we go. "15 seconds. That's with exponential growth at 100% per second. Now, if instead of 100% per second, that had been 3.5% per year, it would have taken me 300 years to fill up that screen, doubling time of roughly 2 decades. Every 2 decades I double whatever I've got. Okay, so now I'm a neoclassical economist, and I say, man, we have been exploiting the hell out of this planet for 300 years, and we've still got half left. Awesome. How much time to use up the other half? 20 more years at 3% growth. Now, let's also grant the economists their wildest dreams, innovation. We somehow innovate ourselves to 3 more planets worth of resources. There is no reason to believe that this is possible. In fact, it is every reason to believe this is not possible. But I'm just granting some unicorns and fairy dust here for just a second. We used up 1 planet, 3.5% growth. How much time to use up the next planet? 20 more years. Now we've used up 2 planets. Doubling time. How much more time to use up the next 2 planets? 20 more years. We did the absolute physically fantastical, the impossible, and it bought us a few decades. This system that we're in is going away. We can put a cap on it of 3 or 4 decades. There is no innovating around it. Now, says Milton Friedman, even Paul Krugman for that matter. You environmental Prius driving, latte sipping, avocado toast licking, crunchy granola tree huggers. You've been telling us for decades and decades that the sky is falling and it never happens. Since Thomas Malthus, and all the way forward to Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb, the limits to growth in 1970. It never happens. What's the argument to that? Well, there's 2. Number 1, it does happen. It's happened many times in history. Locally and regionally, societies and civilizations have in fact overshot their resource bases and collapsed. But now something more fundamental has changed. That change in the middle of the 20th century. What those of us who study this call the Great Acceleration. The exponential growth is kicking in a really big way. We've gone, and the phrasing is often used sometimes from a small world on a big planet, meaning where the human civilization metabolism is small compared to the Earth system processes themselves, to a big world on a small planet. And that happened very quickly, and that is the insidious nature of exponential growth. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine, and then boom, it's not. We just lived through it. Remember March of 2020? Everything is fine. Everything is fine. And then all of a sudden, the hospital's overrun, and people are dying at hundreds of thousands per day, or thousands and thousands per day in this country. Exponential growth. So we've gone to a big world on a small planet. We're in a fundamentally different scenario than humanity has ever been now. This growth is going away. We've entered what the geologists have now termed the Anthropocene, the age of humans. Humans are now the single largest driver of change on the surface of the planet. And what I want to do now, so that's the modern world. So Václav Smil says that this modern world can't survive with these 4 things. I say good riddance. We don't want the modern world. Modern doesn't mean necessarily good. It doesn't mean progressive. It doesn't mean healthy. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means the current world. And he's right. It's going away. And we need it to. Here's a quote from Nature, actually from 10 years ago now. This is, in fact, the situation we're in. Now, why am I telling you all this? I want to introduce you to this framework. This will go pretty quick. The challenge we have as we move forward on all of these fronts, the social justice fronts, the ecological fronts, and the many facets of all of them, is to do so in a way that does not exacerbate the other challenges, the other problems. If you're all about climate change, for example, hydropower sounds like a great idea. It's low carbon, very low carbon. But of course, it's disastrous for the biosphere. Ecosystems are just decimated by hydropower, as are many social systems. It's interlinked, of course. So as we move forward on big moves, big steps to address these crises, we want to make sure we're not exacerbating the other existential crises along the way, whether they be social or ecological. So sorry for that picture. I'm going to build it up real quick. This is called a Planetary Boundaries and Social Foundations Framework. How many of you have heard of planetary boundaries? Okay, It's getting better. It used to be just a hand here or there. We've got maybe like a fifth of you out there. This is a framework that scientists have come up to start to understand the interconnections, the science of our task. So the idea is this. This is where we live, and the Earth system provides for us sort of an ecological ceiling, a place for life to exist, right? And the idea is to identify the critical Earth system processes that make life possible, and in particular, the conditions that we have for human civilization. And they're what you think. They have to do with the atmosphere, they have to do with water, they have to do with land and the oceans. And there's some specific things there. Ozone is very important. The climate system is very important. The idea is to come up with metrics to quantify each of these Earth system processes and then understand where do those metrics stay to provide us the world that we have, how much can we disturb those metrics and still remain in a very Holocene-like state to which civilization needs. So for example, climate, there are two metrics. One of them is atmospheric carbon dioxide, and the other is something called irradiative forcing. It has to do with the amount of energy coming into the planet versus the amount of energy going out. You don't need to worry about that. For land systems, the metrics are the percentage of original tropical and terrestrial and boreal forests, for example. And I won't take you through all the metrics, but the idea is to just quantify them and then see how much we're disturbing them. So there's our ecological ceiling. Now, of course, we don't want to just survive on the planet, we want to thrive. And to do that, we create our human civilization ostensibly for us to thrive, and we build up what we would call a social foundation. And that social foundation also has metrics that the social scientists continue to work. By the way, this is all a work in progress. Very active research on the ecological and the social side on this. And we come up with lots of metrics, maybe a couple of dozen that the social scientists are starting to use, starting with the very basic ones: access to fresh water, clean water, access to food. Think of it as water and food security, housing security, health security. And then we want even more, right? We want to be educated. We want access to vibrant employment and occupation and enough resources to have healthy, productive, happy lives. So we come up with all of these different metrics, and we build out that social foundation. And as we build out that social foundation, what we do is we disturb the Earth system processes. We use the Earth's resources to do that. So as we build out that social foundation, we disrupt the climate, we disrupt the ozone, we disrupt ocean chemistries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is to quantify this. So to the best of our ability, the scientists who work on this, the many, many, many hundreds of scientists who work on this, here's where we sit with our ecological ceiling. Anything that's not green, we've punched a hole in the ceiling, and to the best of our ability to determine, we cannot continue at that level and expect civilization to survive. So at the same time, we have not built up, so we punched big holes in our ecological ceiling: biodiversity loss, I just showed you the biodiversity crash, climate change, ocean acidification, and fresh water has recently changed. I'm going to show you that in a second. But we've built up also a pretty creaky social foundation. Everything in red under that green line there is people living in some form of critical human deprivation. Roughly 3 billion people. I want to take so that's the picture. This is this Planetary Boundaries Social Foundations framework. There's a film called Breaking Boundaries that's really good. It just came out last year, if you want to watch it. By the way, a documentary that goes over this framework. But what I love about this framework is the following. First of all, whoever you are, whatever you're interested in, whatever your talents you bring to the table, you can see yourself plugged into some place on this picture. Sure, if you're a climate scientist or you're an engineer, but if you're a rancher, if you're a farmer, if you're a public policy wonk, if you're a lawyer, if you're a financier, if you're a banker, a chef, there's work in here for you to do. If you're interested in social justice, if you're an artist. One of the biggest pieces of this, I was just talking again to Josh about this before we started, is telling the story. Now, I think I can give a pretty good science lecture, but it's a science lecture at the end of the day. And it wasn't Berkeley sociologists who were connecting us to the dramatic changes of the 60s, right? It was 19-year-old musicians, writers, filmmakers, poets, artists, telling the story in a way that we can connect to and generate meaningful response from is now pretty much the crux of the effort. To the extent that we need technology to address these issues, we have the knowledge and technology we need. We don't need any more. We'll get more, and hopefully that will help. But this is almost entirely a cultural issue at this state, right? So if you're working on any kind of social justice issue, you're working on climate change. You're working on biodiversity loss, as long as you know how to connect those dots. And that's what this framework helps us do, is start to see where our work fits into a much better picture and helps us choose next steps and pathways and efforts that we want to plug ourselves into that are not exacerbating other of these problems, but in fact flipping that and synergistically helping with. And once you understand this framework, there's so much that we can do that synergistically helps other things. At the very base of that, of course, I would say, is working on social issues, cultural issues, particularly economics. Understanding where you have to go. So this is this Planetary Boundaries Social Foundations framework. I'm going to give you an update on those. This is the planetary boundaries, the ecological part of that, on where we are with those. Anything that's not just pure green, if you're in between those two dash lines, that's sort of the zone of uncertainty. We think we're getting close to punching a hole in the ceiling. Anything past that second dash line, we've punched a hole in the ceiling. We are impacting these critical Earth system processes far beyond what we can expect to continue to do and maintain any kind of a Holocene-like state. So the work, of course, from this framework, one more point. Now, you can take this down to a national level. A researcher named Dan O'Neill has done that. So that was kind of at a global scale. But he says, now let's look at it. Let's allot every person on the planet their share of ecological impact. And let's look at it on a country-by-country basis. So here in the United States, everything outside that green line is us overshooting our ecological impact. And everything that's blue is us meeting bare minimums in the social foundation. This is not luxury living. This is just bare minimums. So we've done pretty well with the bare minimum social foundation, but we've way overshot our share of ecological impact in doing so. And compare it with some place like, say, Bangladesh, who isn't even coming close to their share of ecological impact, but of course has built up a much creakier social foundation as a result. And this is important because oftentimes in this discussion, the topic turns to population, and population is no question a piece of the puzzle. But as soon as we start talking about population, people start pointing fingers in the wrong places. The average American has a consumptive footprint of something like 26 times the average Bangladeshi. In other words, a Bangladeshi has to have 26 kids to have the same sort of ecological impact as one single child in the United States. So while population is an issue, it's population where? At the moment. Okay, so the work, of course, is to take this picture and turn it into this picture. This is what we have to do. And when you look at it this way, it's both empowering because hopefully you can see yourself in it, but it also becomes so much bigger than you thought it was, right? It can become debilitating. And all I have to say about that is this. It's not clear that we can fix this. But it's definitely not clear that we can't. So our job is not to hand-wring over whether or not the tasks in front of us can be done. Our job, in my mind, the mindset that helps me, is to identify next steps and take them. That's the job. Identify next steps and take them. And of course, this framework helps us try to identify the steps that we think are most important. So while it's impossible to work on everything, each of us can work on something. And so sometimes I use the phrase, pick something. Just pick something and make it yours. And I think I'm sort of preaching to the choir in that case in this room because I think you all have picked something. That's why you're here. And I thank you. And now hopefully as you go about that work, this picture of interconnections will perhaps help you decide what's a useful next step for me to plug myself into. What we want, of course, and I'll conclude with this, is a sustainable and a just and a vibrant world. That's our goal. We will be sustainable pretty soon, by definition. We're unsustainable now, and by definition that goes away, but most sustainable human states are not pleasant. We want the pleasant ones, the vibrant ones. So there's our goal. Let's move away from what we now call the modern world. Sorry. That quote from Eisenhower, if a problem is too big to be solved, make it bigger. What he means is if you're not seeing a way through, you're not connecting, you're not identifying all the pieces of the problem. Hopefully that's what this framework does for us. The risk of one last cheesy metaphor, we may not see every step to the top of the mountain. Our job is not to see the last 10 steps. Our job is to see the next 10 steps and take those. Thank you very much for your attention.